Tonight we are going to be talking about a man who drank with Billy the Kid, dodged bullets in cattle rustler shootouts, and once roped and saddled a Mustang in under 10 minutes at a rodeo near Deadwood, South Dakota. If you didn't know his name, you'd swear he was a character pulled straight from a dime store western novel or a John Wayne flick. But this wasn't fiction. This was Nat Love, real-life cowboy, expert marksman, rodeo legend, and a formerly enslaved black man. Section 1. He Forgotten Cowboy. Born in 1854 on a plantation near Nashville, Tennessee, Nat Love came into this world wearing shackles. His early life was marked by forced labor and brutal conditions, like millions of other African Americans born into slavery in the antebellum South. But Love would go on to defy not only the system that had once owned him but also the American imagination itself, a mythology that would come to erase men like him entirely from its tales of cowboys, gunslingers, and heroes of the West. When slavery ended, Love, like so many others, found himself free but landless, cashless, and navigating a country that was still hostile to his very existence. But he had something else: grit. At just 15, he left home with a few dollars in his pocket and dreams of adventure. He headed west, the land of open plains, endless cattle trails, and a reputation for danger that only made it more enticing. In Dodge City, Kansas, a town he described as having a great many saloons, dance halls, and gambling houses, and very little of anything else, Love learned the cowboy trade the hard way. He wasn't handed a saddle, he earned it. He learned to break wild horses, tend cattle herds, shoot with deadly precision, and navigate treacherous terrain. He lived out the dangerous, dirty, unpredictable cowboy life that Hollywood would later sanitize for mainstream audiences. But Nat Love's version wasn't made for movie theaters. It was raw, complicated, and more diverse than America wanted to remember. In his 1907 autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Nat Love, better known in the cattle country as Deadwood Dick, he recounted drinking with Billy the Kid, gambling in saloons filled with outlaws, and surviving skirmishes with Native American tribes who were defending their territory from settler encroachment. Yes, he used the term fighting Indians, a phrase that's clearly problematic today, but it reflects both the language and the complicated loyalties of the time. Love, like many cowboys, black, white, and brown, was both a victim of the American system and a participant in its violent expansion. Still, Love's legacy isn't about perfection, it's about presence. He was there. In the thick of it. On horseback. In shootouts. Living the frontier life we've all been taught belonged only to white men with dusty boots and Marlboro Man mustaches. And here's the kicker: Nat Love wasn't some lone exception. He wasn't a fluke. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys in the American West were black. But you wouldn't know that from the films, textbooks, or children's Western toys that painted the frontier in stark white brushstrokes. So how did we lose them? The erasure of black cowboys wasn't accidental, it was engineered. As Jim Crow laws swept across the South and white supremacy metastasized into every branch of American life, the contributions of African Americans were systematically scrubbed from the record. The cowboy, once a multiracial, multicultural figure, was rebranded as exclusively white. It was marketing, mythology, and malice. Love's own words speak to this gap in our collective memory. He wrote not just to entertain, but to document his place in a world that would soon pretend he never existed. His stories weren't embellished, they were a bid for recognition. He knew his legacy was at risk. He knew that if he didn't write it down, America would forget he'd ever ridden those trails. He wrote of being called Deadwood Dick after a rodeo victory in 1876. That day, 6 of the top riders were black. Love beat them all. I roped, threw, tied, bridled, saddled, and mounted my Mustang in exactly 9 minutes from the crack of the gun, he recalled. My record has never been beaten. He wasn't bragging. He was daring the world to remember. Even in old age, when Love traded the saddle for a job as a Pullman porter with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, he never stopped talking about the plains, the horses, the shootouts, and the camaraderie. I gloried in the danger, he wrote, and the wild and free life of the plains. That's what makes his story so essential. Not just because it's true, not just because it's cool, but because it completely wrecks the whitewashed mythology we've all been fed. Nat Love wasn't just a black cowboy. He was the cowboy. The archetype, the real deal. And if Nat Love was real, how many more have we forgotten? Section 2, Slavery, Skill, and the Birth of the Cowboy. Before cowboys roamed the plains as free men with spurs on their boots and rifles on their backs, they were something else entirely, enslaved laborers. The romantic image of the cowboy as a free-spirited icon of American individualism conveniently forgets this uncomfortable truth. The cowboy tradition in the United States was rooted in the forced labor of African Americans. To understand how we got from shackles to saddles, we need to start in Texas. In the early 1800s, Texas was still Mexican territory, but white American settlers were already pouring in, some to escape debt, others seeking cheap land. The Mexican government technically opposed slavery, but it lacked the power to stop these newcomers from bringing enslaved people with them. By 1825, enslaved African Americans made up about a quarter of Texas' settler population. By 1860, that number had climbed to over 30%, nearly 183,000 enslaved people, making Texas one of the fastest-growing slaveholding regions in the South. These weren't just plantation slaves working in fields of cotton and sugarcane. Many were forced to work on sprawling ranches, where they learned to herd cattle, break horses, repair tack, and manage livestock, skills that would become foundational to the cowboy profession. White Texans, busy expanding their empires or riding off to fight in the Civil War, depended on this enslaved workforce to do the hard, technical, and often dangerous labor of managing the herds. The cattle business was booming. Texas' vast, open prairies were ideal for raising longhorns, and by the mid-19th century, the state was overflowing with them, millions of cattle roaming across unclaimed or poorly fenced land. But with most white men gone to fight for the Confederacy, the ranches were left to the people who had always done the real work, the enslaved. They didn't just keep the ranches running. They became the ranches. They learned to read the land like a second language. They knew how to handle a panicked steer, pull calves from muddy ditches, or navigate stormy drives across treacherous terrain. They developed the instincts and endurance that would later define the cowboy mythos. And when emancipation came in 1865, many of these men emerged not just free, but uniquely skilled. But freedom came with a cruel twist. Ranchers returned from the war to find their herds in disarray. Cattle had wandered for years without containment, barbed wire hadn't yet been invented. Fences were a luxury, and most of the state was unfenced, open range. The ranchers needed help, badly. But they could no longer rely on slave labor. That left them with one option: hire the very people they used to own. And so, newly freed black men were hired, not as charity, not out of repentance, but because they were the best. They could rope, ride, and herd better than anyone else. These men, once considered property, were now indispensable. Yet even as they became essential, they remained invisible in the public imagination. As cattle drives became a central part of the Texas economy, thousands of cowboys were needed to move the herds north to Kansas, Colorado, and Missouri, where railroads could ship the beef to hungry cities in the north. These drives could last months and stretch across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. The work was grueling, and the pay was meager, but it was better than most options available to freed black men in the Reconstruction-era South. Being a cowboy meant independence, travel, and, sometimes, a break from the racial caste system that ruled much of post-war America. Out on the trail, what mattered most wasn't your skin color. It was whether you could do the job. And black men could do the job damn well. Their skill wasn't just respected, it was feared. These men were tougher than the land they rode. They had to be. They'd already survived slavery, war, and displacement. They didn't flinch when a herd of longhorns spooked in the night. They didn't panic when a river crossing turned deadly. They didn't complain when the only thing they had to eat was beans and coffee for the 5th week in a row. They were survival incarnate. The word cowboy itself carries the legacy of this brutal history. The term was originally used as a racial slur. Cowboy was how white cattle owners referred to black men working with cattle, just like houseboy or field boy. The white workers were called cowhands or wranglers. But over time, cowboy evolved. It became synonymous with toughness, resilience, and rugged masculinity. The irony? The very word that was once used to degrade black men became a badge of American pride, without crediting the black men who earned it. And so the cycle continued. Black cowboys helped shape a nation, even as that nation denied them credit. Their fingerprints are all over the history of the West, but their names rarely appear in the credits. The legend of the cowboy, gritty, fearless, loyal, isn't just a tall tale. It's real. But the men who defined it weren't all white. They weren't all welcome in saloons. They didn't all ride into the sunset with a Hollywood soundtrack behind them. Some of them were born in bondage, raised on horseback, and buried with no headstone. And yet, they rode anyway. Section 3, Life on the Trail, rough, real, and racially blurred. By the time the post-Civil War cattle boom was in full swing, thousands of black cowboys had become essential figures on the trails stretching from Texas to Kansas, Colorado, and Missouri. These were no easy rides. These were multi-month death marches for the unprepared, where the rules of society frayed in the dust and blood of the open range. And for black cowboys, it was a strange paradox. Riding into a world that both accepted them and refused to acknowledge them. Cattle drives were long, dirty, and brutally physical. A typical drive might span 1,000 miles over 3 to 5 months. Cowboys would be in the saddle for 18 hours a day, sleeping on the ground with only a saddle blanket and the stars for cover. Meals? If they were lucky, beans, bacon, and biscuit. Water? Scarce, and usually muddy. They faced river crossings that drowned cattle by the dozen, lightning storms that spooked stampedes, wolves, rattlesnakes, and the constant threat of attack, either from rustlers or from Native American groups defending their ancestral land. Yet despite these conditions, many freedmen chose the trail life over other post-emancipation options like sharecropping, domestic labor, or factory work. Because out on the trail, the rigid social caste system of the South had less power. Out there, nobody cared if you were black, white, or Mexican, as long as you could ride, rope, and survive. And that's exactly what black cowboys did. They survived. And more than that, they led. Some became trail bosses, managing entire cattle crews. Others were appointed as point men, the position at the front of the herd, a role requiring leadership, calm under pressure, and the skill to navigate terrain. Black cowboys earned their stripes the hard way, by proving themselves in the dust and chaos of the drive. Take the case of Beauregard, a formerly enslaved man who became one of the most trusted cowboys on the famous Goodnight Loving Trail. Icard worked for Charles Goodnight, yes, that Goodnight, of the legendary duo Goodnight and Loving, and was so valued that Goodnight personally wrote his epitaph. Served with me for years on the Goodnight Loving Trail, never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches. Splendid behavior. Goodnight didn't give praise lightly. Beauregard had become a cowboy's cowboy. Respected by white men not because they were progressive, but because Icard was simply that good. And on the trail, skill mattered more than race. This unique space of meritocracy meant that, for a brief window in American history, black men experienced something they rarely encountered anywhere else: respect. Nat Love described this camaraderie in poetic detail. A braver, truer set of men never lived than these wild sons of the plains whose home was in the saddle and their couch, Mother Earth, with the sky for a covering. They were always ready to share their blanket and their last ration with a less fortunate fellow companion, and always assisted each other in the many trying situations that were continually coming up in a cowboy's life. The trail forged bonds between men who, in town, might have never spoken to one another. On horseback, surrounded by danger, race took a backseat to grit. When a herd stampeded in the middle of the night, you didn't stop to ask your bunkmate's background, you just rode like hell. And that's not to say racism vanished on the trail. It didn't. Towns remained segregated. Hotels and restaurants routinely denied service to black cowboys. Pay was often lower, promotion slower. But when you were 300 miles from civilization, color lines blurred fast. It was an ecosystem governed by respect, necessity, and the reality that your life could depend on the man riding beside you. Still, once the cattle were delivered and the cowboys returned to town, that respect often disappeared like dust in the wind. Black cowboys were expected to dismount their horses before entering towns where Negroes weren't allowed to ride openly. They had to eat at separate chuck wagons if the trail crew stopped near a settlement. If a fight broke out in a saloon, a black cowboy could be arrested just for being present, while his white companions walked free. But ask any black cowboy of the era what kept them riding, and you'll hear the same thing: freedom. Not freedom in the 4th of July sense. Not the kind that gets you a vote or a mortgage. But freedom of movement. Freedom from the overseer. Freedom from the factory foreman. The freedom to ride into the sunrise with no master, no chains, and no ceiling. There was dignity in that. There was pride in earning your keep by your saddle sores, your roping calluses, and the mud on your boots. Even the cowboy's uniform, denim jeans, wide-brimmed hat, bandana over the mouth, was designed for utility, not vanity. It said, "I work. I ride. I survive." And so the trail became a paradoxical safe haven. A cruel, violent, beautiful brotherhood of men united by labor, sweat, and danger. In that space, black cowboys weren't just tolerated, they were respected. Not in every case. Not always. But enough that many chose the saddle over everything else. For some, it was the only life they'd ever known. For others, it was the only life that made them feel seen. The cattle trails carved paths through the heart of America, and in their dust, they left behind stories of resilience that we're only just starting to uncover. Section 4: Cowboy Fame, Bill Pickett and Rodeo Legends. By the late 1800s, the open-range cowboy life was already fading. Barbed wire crisscrossed the land. Railroads replaced the need for long cattle drives. And the once vast frontier was being fenced off, subdivided, and sold. But just as the classic cowboy job was dying, a new form of cowboy culture was emerging, one that would elevate certain names into legend and rewrite how Americans saw the West. One of the first black men to ride that wave of fame was Bill Pickett, and his story is nothing short of jaw-dropping. Born in 1870 in Travis County, Texas, to formerly enslaved parents, Bill Pickett grew up in a world that offered very little to black boys besides back-breaking labor and endless humiliation. But Pickett had something different. He had nerve, skill, and a love for the wild art of ranching. By the time he was a teenager, he had dropped out of school and gone full-time into ranch work, handling cattle, breaking horses, and learning tricks that would one day turn him into a global icon. But let's talk about what really made Pickett famous. It wasn't just his fearlessness or his charm, it was a move so wild, so raw, that people couldn't believe it until they saw it. Pickett watched the ranch dogs work cattle. Specifically, he watched how they would run up to a steer and bite its upper lip, forcing it to drop to the ground in pain and submission. Inspired, Pickett developed his own version of the technique. When a steer broke loose from the herd, he would leap from his horse, grab the animal by the horns, and then bite its lip, wrestling it to the ground with nothing but teeth and tenacity. He called it bulldogging. And it became a sensation. It was dangerous. It was dramatic. It was pure showmanship. And it caught fire. By the early 1900s, Pickett was performing with the Miller Brothers' 101 Ranch Wild West show, a touring spectacle that showcased the best riders, ropers, and sharpshooters in the country. Pickett shared stages with big names like Will Rogers and Tom Mix, entertaining presidents and kings from Texas to England. But while white performers were plastered across posters and newspapers, Bill Pickett's image was often altered or downplayed. Many show promoters falsely billed him as being of Native American descent, thinking that audiences would be more accepting of a Comanche bulldogger than a black man biting cows in a white man's sport. It was the same old story: celebrate the talent, erase the identity. Yet Pickett's legend was too big to stay buried. He became the first black cowboy to star in his own motion pictures, The Bulldogger and The Crimson Skull, silent films released in the 1920s. Though much of the footage has been lost to time, these films stand as early examples of a black cowboy not just existing, but dominating, in American cinema. Pickett's fame exploded. He toured globally. He influenced generations. And yet, when he died in 1932 after being kicked in the head by a bronco, his name faded from popular memory. It wasn't until 1972, a full 40 years after his death, that Bill Pickett was finally inducted into the National Rodeo Hall of Fame, making him the first black cowboy to receive the honor. Today, bulldogging, now known as steer wrestling, remains a core event in professional rodeos, a lasting tribute to the ingenuity of a man who turned observation into legend. But Pickett wasn't alone. Nat Love, who we've already met, also became a rodeo competitor. In 1876, after delivering cattle near Deadwood, South Dakota, he entered a local roping contest with 6 other colored cowboys. He dominated the event, completing a full routine: roping, tying, bridling, saddling, and riding a Mustang in just 9 minutes. That victory earned him the nickname Deadwood Dick, a moniker pulled from dime novel pulp stories but now forever attached to a real black cowboy who proved he was the best. Rodeos became the new stage for cowboys of all colors to show off their skill. But as the sport gained national attention, black cowboys were once again pushed to the margins. Many were barred from competing in front of crowds. In some cities, black rodeo performers were only allowed to ride after the white audience had gone home. Despite the obstacles, the black rodeo spirit endured. Take Cleo Hearn, for example, a name you're going to hear more about soon. Hearn became the first black cowboy to win a major calf roping event in 1970. He was also the first African American to attend college on a rodeo scholarship and the first black man to appear as the Marlboro Man in a national ad campaign. But perhaps his most lasting legacy came when he founded the Cowboys of Color Rodeo, a traveling rodeo dedicated to showcasing diverse talent in a sport that had long ignored it. These modern-day pioneers weren't just athletes. They were historians. Their presence was a protest. Their wins were reparations. The rodeo arena, once a hostile space, became a proving ground, not just for speed and agility, but for legacy. And legacy matters. Because every steer roped, every bronco tamed, every lip-bitten cow pulled to the dirt in front of a cheering crowd, those moments are living memory. They're the proof that the story of the cowboy wasn't just written in white. It was forged in blood, sweat, and teeth by black men who weren't afraid to grip the reins of history and ride it into the spotlight. Section 5. Modern Rodeos and Cultural Revival. When Bill Pickett died in 1932, the era of the old frontier cowboy was already a ghost. The Wild West had been paved over by highways, fenced by barbed wire, and swallowed up by Hollywood. But the spirit of the cowboy didn't die, it evolved. It moved to stadiums, arenas, and dirt-covered rodeo rings. And in those arenas, a new generation of black cowboys and cowgirls kept the fire burning. Let's rewind to the 1950s and 60s. This was a time when Jim Crow laws still clung to life across much of the United States, when segregation and racism defined daily life. For many black Americans, upward mobility was blocked at every turn. But if you were born in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, or New Mexico, there was still one path, dusty and dangerous as it was, that could offer pride, purpose, and possibility: rodeo. Cleo Hearn took that path. He was born in Oklahoma and became a professional cowboy in 1959. In an era when black cowboys weren't even allowed to ride in some rodeos, Hearn made history. In 1970, he became the first black cowboy to win a major calf roping event at a national competition. That moment should have opened floodgates. It didn't. He was still excluded from many events. In some towns, he had to rope behind the arena after the crowd had cleared. At other times, he was allowed to compete, but not celebrate. But Hearn didn't fold. He kept riding. He kept roping. And he kept building. After attending Langston University on a rodeo scholarship, another first, he went on to appear in commercials for Ford, Pepsi, and Levi's. He even became the first black Marlboro man, an icon of rugged masculinity. But the real legacy of Cleo Hearn began in 1971, when he created something that would change the game forever. He founded the Cowboys of Color Rodeo. This wasn't just a showcase of black cowboy talent. It was a full-on celebration of diversity in a sport that had long been segregated. The rodeo featured African American, Native American, and Hispanic riders, athletes whose ancestors helped settle the West but had been left out of its legend. More than just a competition, Cowboys of Color became a traveling museum of forgotten history. Between events, announcers told stories of Buffalo soldiers, black lawmen, and rodeo pioneers. They played R&B over the loudspeakers. They opened each show with the Black National Anthem. And they made damn sure every child in the crowd saw someone who looked like them wearing a 10-gallon hat and owning the arena. Today, Cowboys of Color hosts over 200 athletes annually. They compete in roping, bronc riding, barrel racing, and steer wrestling, the same events as the mainstream rodeo circuit, but with a twist: they carry a message. As Cleo Hearn put it, "Let us entertain you while we educate you." And that education is working. One of the most inspiring aspects of the rodeo revival is the way it's brought women, especially black cowgirls, into the spotlight. Take Sharon Braxton, for example. One of the first African American women to compete in barrel racing at a professional level. In a sport long dominated by white women, Braxton showed that elegance and grit weren't mutually exclusive. She trained relentlessly, faced discrimination at nearly every level, and still managed to rope her place into history. Or look at the next generation. Young cowgirls like Michaela Laney, who grew up competing in youth rodeos with dreams of making it to the pros. For girls like her, the Cowboys of Color Rodeo isn't just a show, it's proof that they belong. And the impact isn't limited to the arena. The rise of these rodeos has sparked a cultural revival that blends tradition, rebellion, and identity. Western wear has made a comeback in black fashion. Cowboy hats, fringe jackets, boots, and belt buckles are no longer seen as white style, they've been reclaimed as black expression. Artists like Solange, Cardi B, and Megan Thee Stallion have all worn cowboy-inspired looks in major campaigns. Even Rihanna appeared in a cowboy-themed shoot that paid homage to black rodeo heritage. And then there's Beyoncé, whose 2024 album Cowboy Carter didn't just nod at the culture, it put a spotlight on it. But this revival isn't about fashion trends or album covers. It's about visibility. It's about control over a narrative that was stolen. It's about saying, "We've always been here, you just chose not to see us." Modern rodeos give that visibility life. They make black cowboys and cowgirls unignorable. They take a legacy that was buried and pull it back into the sunlight, hoof prints and all. And they're doing more than just entertaining crowds, they're building infrastructure. There are now rodeo camps, mentorship programs, and scholarships aimed specifically at youth of color. Organizations like Inner City Rodeo, Compton Junior Equestrians, and the Philadelphia Urban Riding Academy are training a new generation not only to ride, but to lead. The modern black rodeo scene is no longer a sideshow. It's a movement. One that reaches back 150 years into history and gallops straight into the future. Because for every gate that was closed, a new arena is opening. And this time, the announcer isn't whispering black names, he's shouting them. Section 6, Hollywood's whitewash and the cowboy reclaim. It's one thing to be erased from history books. It's another to be replaced in cinema by a fantasy version of yourself. For decades, the image of the American cowboy, rugged, heroic, lone gunman with a quick draw and a slower moral code, was defined not by history, but by Hollywood. And Hollywood had a habit of choosing aesthetics over accuracy. In that version of the West, cowboys were always white. They had names like Wyatt, Jesse, Butch, or Shane. They fought savage tribes, rescued damsels, and rode off into the sunset in slow motion. But there was one small problem: it was all a lie. The real West was a chaotic, multicultural powder keg. It was built by Mexican vaqueros, Chinese railroad workers, Native American scouts, black trail bosses, and women tougher than boot leather. But the silver screen stripped all of that down to a single archetype: the white cowboy with a clean jawline and a six-shooter. And when black people were shown in westerns, they were servants, sidekicks, comic relief, sometimes silent, sometimes shuffling, always secondary. Yet even in those shadows, truth managed to push through. One of the most compelling stories Hollywood stole and rebranded was that of Bass Reeves, a real-life deputy U.S. Marshal who arrested over 3,000 criminals during his 32-year career. He was fluent in multiple native languages, worked alongside indigenous trackers, and was known for his stealth, marksmanship, and unshakable sense of justice. Sound familiar? It should, because Reeves is widely believed to be the real-life inspiration for the Lone Ranger. You know the guy, the masked white man with the silver bullets and the Native American sidekick. Hollywood took Reeves' story, changed his race, erased his name, and sold him back to the public as a fiction. Bass Reeves is the closest person to resemble the Lone Ranger, says Western historian Art T. Burton. He is undoubtedly the greatest frontier hero in U.S. history. But for nearly a century, Reeves' name was unknown outside of historians and dusty libraries. That started to change in the 2000s, when biographies like Burton's Black Gun, Silver Star began to circulate. In 2023, actor David Oyelowo starred in a series about Reeves, bringing his story to life for a new generation. For many, it was the first time they realized their favorite cowboy archetype had been based on a black man all along. Hollywood hadn't just whitewashed the cowboy, it had stolen black legends, painted them beige, and repackaged them for mass consumption. But like any good Western tale, the story doesn't end with theft, it ends with a reclaiming. Enter the era of the Black Western Renaissance. Films like Concrete Cowboy, 2020, shined a spotlight on Philadelphia's urban black equestrian scene, focusing on the real-life Fletcher Street riders who've been holding it down for decades. Starring Idris Elba and Caleb McLaughlin, the movie didn't just tell a good story. It told a true one. Then came The Harder They Fall, 2021, a star-studded, stylized shoot-'em-up with a nearly all-black cast. Characters were named after real historical figures: Nat Love, Stagecoach Mary, Rufus Buck, who had all been erased from Hollywood's version of the West. Directed by Jamie Samuel and produced by Jay-Z, the film made a loud, unapologetic statement: "We were here. And we looked this good doing it." The soundtrack slapped. The visuals popped. But the history? That was the real flex. Even Jordan Peele's genre-bending Nope, 2022, injected cowboy imagery into a modern sci-fi horror context, centering a black family that owned and trained Hollywood stunt horses. It wasn't a Western, but it was steeped in the aesthetics and symbolism of one, and it made black cowboys visible in yet another space. And then, of course, there's Beyoncé. In 2024, she dropped Cowboy Carter, a genre-blending album rooted in country, western, gospel, and soul. The imagery was bold. Black cowgirls in red, white, and blue fringe, boots and braids, rodeo royalty with grills and glamour. The album paid tribute to the black origins of country and cowboy culture while reclaiming a space that had long been labeled as not for us. But it wasn't just about style. It was about rewriting the visual language of the West. Because when people grow up seeing only one kind of cowboy, they start to believe that's the only kind that ever existed. These films, albums, and stories are shattering that illusion, one bullet, one boot, one verse at a time. And there's more coming. New series, documentaries, and animated projects are in development all over the entertainment world, featuring black cowboys and frontier figures once thought lost to history. Schools are incorporating their stories into history curricula. Museums are launching exhibitions. Influencers and artists are embracing the aesthetic with a newfound understanding of its roots. Hollywood might have ignored black cowboys for 100 years, but they're making up for lost time now. Not with pity. Not with tokenism. With truth. And that truth is powerful. Because once you've seen a black cowboy center frame, riding hard, standing tall, staring down injustice, you can't unsee it. And you'll never look at a whitewashed Western the same way again. Section 7, Cultural Explosion, From the Streets to the Stables. If you asked a random person in 1990 what a cowboy looked like, odds are they'd picture someone white, rural, and probably named Clint. But if you ask that same question today, you might hear something very different. You might hear about a cowboy from Compton. Or a black cowgirl riding through the streets of Philadelphia. You might hear about Brianna Noble, riding her horse down the middle of an Oakland protest with a cardboard "Black Lives Matter" sign strapped to the saddle. Because in the last decade, black cowboy culture hasn't just returned, it's exploded. And not in some niche, underground way. This is front page, front row, mainstream visibility. Let's start with Compton, California, a place most known for rap music, gang struggles, and media stereotypes. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll find the Compton Cowboys, a group of black men and women who ride horses through the same streets people once called the wildest part of LA. Their motto? Streets raised us. Horses saved us. Founded by Randy Savvy and his cousins, the Compton Cowboys aren't some cosplay novelty. They're the real deal, training horses, mentoring youth, and using the cowboy lifestyle to offer an alternative to gangs and violence. Their ranch isn't a hobby spot. It's a cultural beacon. And they're not alone. In Philadelphia, the Fletcher Street Urban Riding Club has kept equestrian traditions alive for nearly a century in black neighborhoods often written off by the city. Their stables are surrounded by row houses, their trails are city blocks. But the spirit is the same: discipline, freedom, and connection with an animal that doesn't care what your zip code is. Riders like Erin Brown, aka the Concrete Cowgirl, are at the heart of this movement. She started riding at 7 and never stopped. For her, the barn wasn't just a hobby, it was a lifeline. A lot of my peers are no longer here due to gun violence and drug overdoses, she said. I had a responsibility to go to the barn every day and take care of my horse, so I wasn't engaging in a lot of what my peers were doing. After appearing in Concrete Cowboy and working with filmmakers like Ricky Staub, Erin co-founded the Philadelphia Urban Riding Academy, where she now teaches riding skills and horse care to the next generation. These aren't isolated examples. From Houston's Black Trail Riding Clubs to Chicago's Broken Arrow horseback riders, urban equestrianism is seeing a renaissance. Community stables are rising up where you'd least expect them. Black-owned ranches are reclaiming land and history. And the cowboy aesthetic is being remixed into something fierce, fresh, and unapologetically black. Social media has taken this even further. Scroll through TikTok or Instagram and you'll see young riders in gold grills, cowboy boots, and leather dusters lip-syncing to Megan Thee Stallion while leading a Mustang through an empty lot. You'll see cowgirls twerking on saddles at parades in Houston. You'll see rodeo athletes jumping off galloping horses in slow-mo, set to trap beats and gospel hymns. This is more than nostalgia. This is reclamation. One key moment that pushed black cowboy culture into the global spotlight came during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. As the streets filled with marchers, tear gas, and National Guard patrols, horseback riders emerged in places like Houston, Oakland, and Atlanta. They weren't riding for show. They were riding for protection, for pride, for memory. When Brianna Noble trotted down Oakland's main boulevard on her horse, Dapper Dan, jaws dropped. She wasn't yelling. She didn't have a megaphone. But her presence was louder than anything else. "I'm just another protester if I go down there alone," she said. But no one can ignore a black woman sitting on top of a horse. She was right. Images of her ride went viral. They were printed on posters, projected onto buildings, and shared across every continent. In one photo, she sits in full control, jeans, hoodie, braids tight, horse calm amid the chaos. Behind her, police in riot gear. In front of her, history being made. These were more than protest images. They were prophetic. Because they reminded America of what had been erased: black people on horseback, in power, commanding space. And that message resonated in more ways than one. Country music, rodeo gear, and Western style, all once stereotyped as white, have been flipped inside out and rebranded. Now it's not uncommon to see a Gucci cowboy hat, a Louis Vuitton bag, or a cowboy boot stomp in a Beyoncé video. Fashion shows have taken notice too. In 2024, Pharrell Williams dropped a Western-themed Louis Vuitton collection at Paris Fashion Week. It was full of fringe, bolo ties, and swagger. But more importantly, it was modeled almost entirely by black men. The message was clear: this look is ours, and always has been. And back in the US, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, founded in 1984, continues to travel the country, introducing thousands of new fans each year to the reality of black rodeo culture. Thanks to a broadcast deal struck in 2021, the rodeo aired on national TV the same day Juneteenth became a federal holiday. That moment? Symbolic perfection. Because Juneteenth was born in Texas, on the land that built the cowboy legacy. And now, black cowboys are taking it back, on live television, in front of millions. In a sea of red, white, and blue, the rodeo opened with the black national anthem. Riders carried Pan-African flags. Announcers educated the crowd between rounds about Buffalo Soldiers and Bill Pickett's legacy. Kids in the stands wore cowboy hats that actually fit their identity. "We tell history at our rodeo," says Margot LaDrew, the rodeo's national director. Looking at those kids' faces when they come to the rodeo and see cowboys in those outfits and they're roping, we have heroes. Not just entertainment. Not just nostalgia. Revolution. Because it turns out, all it takes to change the future is one well-timed ride into the present. Section 8. Legacy, Pride, and What's Next. In the early 1900s, Nat Love, Deadwood Dick himself, hung up his saddle and joined the ranks of Pullman porters on the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. He left behind the range, but not the life. In his memoir, he wrote with deep affection about the wild and free plains, the danger, the dust, and the brotherhood. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling. One he knew history might try to forget. And for a long time, it did. But today, that legacy has thundered back like hooves on prairie dirt. You can see it in the packed stands of the Bill Pickett Rodeo. You can hear it in the boots clacking on concrete in Compton. You can feel it in the pride radiating off black cowboys and cowgirls reclaiming the land, the style, the music, and the identity. This isn't a resurgence. It's a reckoning. Because once you know the truth, that 1 in 4 cowboys were black, that the origins of rodeo culture run through plantations and ranches maintained by enslaved hands, that the Lone Ranger was inspired by a black lawman named Bass Reeves, you can't unknow it. And you can't ignore what it means. It means the myth of the West wasn't just inaccurate, it was stolen. Built on the backs of black labor, yet sold as a white dream. But myths are fragile things. They crumble when confronted with reality. And the black cowboy? That's a reality that refuses to die. It's in the gravestones of trail bosses like Bo Sicard. It's in the etched boots of Bill Pickett. It's in the aching hands of Sharon Braxton, the roar of Cleo Hearn, the silence of every unnamed black cowboy buried beneath unmarked prairie dust. But even more than that, it's in the living. It's in the kids at cowboy summer camps, learning to rope while nodding to Kendrick Lamar. It's in Beyoncé's Rodeo album and Pharrell's designer spurs. It's in the mothers braiding their daughters' hair before barrel racing practice. It's in the fathers tightening saddle straps under city bridges. The black cowboy isn't a relic. He's a renaissance. She's a revival. And for the first time in a long time, they're visible. But it wasn't easy getting here. The erasure was deliberate. Post-Civil War backlash swept black economic and political gains under the rug, and the cowboy, once a space of multiracial cooperation, was refitted to serve white nostalgia. Historians ignored the facts. Film directors buried the truth. Toy manufacturers, authors, textbook writers, all played a role in the cultural blackout. What we were left with was a Western fantasy as false as a prop revolver. But thanks to the work of scholars like William Loren Katz, Art T. Burton, and M.I.A. Mask, and cultural curators like Larry Callies of the Black Cowboy Museum in Texas, the truth clawed its way back into daylight. And here's the wildest part, it's still unfolding. Because black cowboy culture isn't just looking backward, it's building forward. In California, Camp Giddy Up, founded by actor Glynn Turman, teaches urban youth how to ride, care for horses, and understand the ethics of ranch life. Turman, who has served as a co-grand marshal at countless Bill Piquet rodeos, puts it best. It's respect for your fellow man. A straight-up honesty. A firm handshake. A certain respect for the animals that are your partner in your work. Those values matter. Especially now. In a world of screens, speed, and digital everything, the cowboy represents something slower, but deeper. A return to earth. A connection to rhythm. A reminder that control comes not from domination, but from trust, between rider and horse, man and land, past and future. And that's why this story matters. Not just because it rewrites the past, but because it reclaims space, literal, cultural, and psychological. For too long, black children grew up thinking cowboy hats didn't fit their heads. That the saddle was off limits. That the open range belonged to someone else. Now, those same kids are riding through parades, gracing magazine covers, roping on TikTok, starring in films, and riding with heads high and boots planted. They're not guests in cowboy culture. They're heirs. And they're bringing flavor, fire, and authenticity to a legacy that had been robbed of its soul. So what's next? More movies. More books. More stables in cities. More faces at rodeos that look like the real West. More land being bought by black ranchers. More kids trading trouble for trail rides. More history being taught the way it actually happened. The frontier is no longer a whitewashed fantasy. It's wide open again. And the black cowboy, once buried beneath 100 years of silence, is back in the saddle.